Sooner or later, most students realize that their Chinese isn't as good as they think it ought to be. Why is that, and what can you do about it? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about depressing things such as frustration and disappointment. And of course, Chinese is mostly a fun endeavor, but sometimes we get frustrated and disappointed, maybe because our Chinese isn't as good as we think it ought to be. This realization can come in many different situations, such as if you've studied mostly on your own, and then when you try out your Chinese with a real person, you find it hard to string together sentences, or even more commonly, you find it very difficult to understand what they are saying to you. Another situation might be if you apply for a course or similar, where there is a specific requirement for a certain level of Chinese, or that you've studied Chinese for a certain amount of time, and you have done that, but then when you show up in the first class, you have no clue what's going on, and it's obviously too difficult for you. And you wonder, what about all these other people? How could they reach this level while I have not? Am I stupid? Have I done something wrong? And so on. And that's indeed exactly what we're going to look at in this episode. Another common situation, which I'm not going to talk about in this episode, is if you try to tackle something that it actually is very hard before you are ready for it. So for example, if you've studied Chinese seriously for a year and you think that now I want to read novels, authentic novels in Chinese. And if you're studying a language like, say, Spanish, you might actually be able to do that. But when it comes to Chinese, you will probably find that most sentences have several characters you have never seen, and even if you do understand all the characters occasionally, you will still struggle with the grammar and making everything make sense. Another example might be if you have studied Chinese for one semester and you still think that tones are difficult, and that is perfectly normal. Very few people master tones in one semester, and that is completely fine. But this kind of situation is not what I want to talk about today. I think they are more about having unrealistic expectations of how long it takes to acquire certain skills. And that is not the same as realizing that your Chinese is not as good as it ought to be. And then, of course, we need to ask the question of how good your Chinese ought to be. But there are two ways of figuring this out, I think. The first is to compare with some kind of stable outside framework, such as a curriculum for a course. And I mentioned this in an example already. So if you're applying for a course that is designed for people who have studied, say, full-time for 1 year, and you get into that program, but you realize that everybody knows more than you do and you cannot keep up with the content, then maybe your Chinese isn't as good as you think it ought to be. The second example is related. Instead of comparing with a framework, you just compare with other people. So if you talk with people who have studied roughly as much as you have, and you figure that they are all miles ahead of you, then maybe you will have the realization that, oh, my Chinese isn't as good as I think it ought to be. And of course, you can't compare with one single person, and we are very different when it comes to how quickly we learn and things like that, and we have differences in the learning environments, the strategies we use, and so on. But on average, if you talk to people who have studied for a year, and you have studied for a year, and you figure that they are twice as good as you are, maybe it's time to think about what's going on. So what is going on? I think many of us have had this realization. Maybe some of us have even had it more than once. So what I want to do now is to go through various possible answers to this question. This can be sorted roughly into two categories, one looking at what and how you study, and the second one looking at how much you are studying. Let's start with the second one because it's easier to talk about, even though there are a lot of misconceptions regarding this. So when you ask people for how long they have studied Chinese, they will typically give an answer in years. And this is, of course, a convenient way of giving an answer. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you think about this, you'll realize that years is a very, very bad unit for counting how much you have learned. Because, of course, how many years have elapsed since you first started learning Chinese is completely irrelevant. It's not like there is a timer that started when you started learning Chinese and after a certain amount of time you will reach a certain level. Obviously, it is what you do with that time and how much you actually engage with the language that counts. And this is counted in hours or minutes or seconds. It is not counted in years. To verify that this is actually the case, I did a small survey a few years ago where I asked readers to answer questions about how much they have been learning Chinese. So it was pretty simple. The first question was simply how many years they have been learning. Then I asked them to make a quick estimate of how many hours they had studied, and then I helped them out doing a more guided, careful estimation of how many hours they had spent learning. The results were quite interesting, and they showed, of course, that years really is a meaningful unit, because you can find people who study more in 1 year than some people study in 10 years. It was also interesting to see that many people greatly overestimated how much time they had spent. So if they made a quick estimate of how much they've studied in recent years, and then they sat down and made a more careful estimation where they actually thought through weeks, what did they do during a typical day and so on, and then made an estimation after doing that. And those numbers turned out much lower than the quick guesses, meaning that people looking back tend to think that they've done more studying than they actually have. I made a similar observations many years ago when I compared how much someone who studies full-time spends learning compared to someone learning in high school. This was in Sweden, of course, but I think these numbers are probably comparable with other nations. So the result was that in 3 months of studying full-time, you probably accumulate more time learning a language than you do if you study it for 6 or 7 years in school. So then you can have someone saying, hey, I've studied Chinese for 7 years, and then another person who started learning this July, and they will actually have studied roughly the same number of hours. Of course, I'm picking the extreme cases here. I just want to show that if you say you've learned Chinese for a certain number of years and expect to be able to do something, that is an almost completely meaningless statement in the context of trying to answer the question of why your Chinese isn't as good as you think it ought to be. And of course, the solution here is that you might have spent much less time learning Chinese than you think. If you're comparing with other people, maybe they studied much more than you did. Maybe the course you find very hard right now actually required you to have studied a lot more than you did during the semesters where you did study Chinese. But let's say this isn't your problem. You are well aware of this, or you might even have credits that prove that you have studied for a certain number of semesters and your course requires this number of semesters, and that's why you think your Chinese ought to be good enough, but then you figure out that it isn't. What should you do then? Well, now we need to look at where you invested all that time. What activities did you do? How did you learn? A very simple analysis might look at the skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, for example. If you spent all your time listening, then obviously you're not going to get very good at reading. And if you spent all your time writing characters, well, then that probably doesn't mean your pronunciation improved a lot by doing that. Learning Chinese is a very complex process, and if you haven't really looked into it or thought about it a lot, it might look simpler than it actually is. You might, for example, think that learning Chinese is a little bit like going to the gym to get fit. And superficially, this looks plausible. For example, everybody knows that if you want to get better at doing pull-ups, you don't practice squats. And hours on a treadmill will not improve your bench press either. Sure, there is more transfer between more complex tasks. So for example, if I practice gymnastics, I might find that I have better body control, which is useful for playing football. Or if I play lots of tennis, I might get slightly better at running, and so on. The rule of thumb here is still that practice makes perfect, at least on an amateur level. That means that if you want to get better at something, you just practice that thing. But this is not really the case for language learning, or at least the relationship between the different skills is much more complex. So for example, I think everybody knows that if you want to get good at writing, you need to read a lot. So it's not that I want to get good at writing, you then sit down in your room and you write and write and write, and then you come out and you have suddenly mastered how to write in a foreign language. That's not how it works. What you do instead is that you sit down and you read and you read and you read and you read a lot, and then when you've read a lot and you start writing, you will be able to gradually transfer all of that knowledge that you've now collected about the language into output, into writing. But if you remove that input, the writing activity itself might have very little effect on your writing ability, which is not at all like getting fit. In general, input such as listening and reading is much more important than output when learning a language. Naturally, there's more to it than that. We also have communicative aspects, we need to develop strategies and so on, but you can't really treat learning Chinese like going to the gym. If you want a more in-depth discussion about how to balance these different skills, we did talk about that in episode 42. This leads us to the concept of validity, which in this case refers to how useful something that you do is in the situation you are practicing for. The question of which activities result in learning is of course extremely complex, and it's a whole research field all on its own, and it's not something I can summarize here. But if I were to say something at least, it might be that it's about mapping form, so spoken or written words, to meaning while also interacting with others and developing communicative strategies. This means that there's a whole range of activities that students and teachers engage in that don't really count as learning or won't at least directly result in learning. So, for example, if you are listening to a podcast to improve your Chinese listening ability, the bits in English don't really contribute. They don't count as listening practice. So if you're listening to a podcast that is, say, 10 minutes long and it contains a Chinese dialogue that is 30 seconds long and it's repeated, say, 4 times, then you're not spending 10 minutes listening, you're actually spending 2.5 minutes. Or if you extend that over a whole year, you can see that most of the time you think you are spending on listening is actually spent doing something else. Other examples of this kind might be reading descriptions of how grammar works, so explicitly learning about grammar or pronunciation or anything else in English, or living in a Chinese-speaking country. So you don't learn Chinese by osmosis just by being in China, although of course if you do listen to people, at least your listening will improve. But where you are located geographically doesn't automatically result in learning. Same goes for classes where your teacher spends a lot of time explaining, say, Chinese culture in English. That might be interesting and valuable, but it doesn't count as, say, listening practice or anything related to the actual language. My final example is, of course, this podcast, because even if I hope you find it interesting, this does not count as Chinese listening practice. Although my hope is, of course, that listening to the podcast or visiting Hacking Chinese or doing any of the other things I just mentioned might accelerate your learning and make the hours that you do spend learning more efficient. Let's talk a little bit about Chinese courses and formal education, because the idea for this article was actually spawned by a very specific question. I've recently spent an inordinate amount of time organizing and structuring new Chinese courses at a university, and that includes relating them to each other, figuring out what the relationship is in terms of difficulty, what's the minimum requirements, how do you get from one course to the other, and so on and so forth. And defining levels for such courses is actually quite difficult. Like, how do you describe the minimum requirements for a course? Do you say that they have to have a certain number of credits? Do you say that they have to have studied a certain number of hours? Well, we know now that you shouldn't ask for a certain number of years, but most people don't know how many hours they've studied, so is that better to ask for? Or maybe something completely different? Some of these courses have just started, and one student complained that they had actually studied for several times longer than the minimum requirement for that course, but they said that they still found it incredibly difficult to follow the course and that it was on a way too advanced level. They did not feel prepared to have lessons entirely in Chinese. The reason this question was interesting to me was because I happen to know a little bit about this person's study background. Now, I don't know this person personally, but I know the institution at which they studied before, and I know what the courses there are like. They typically focus heavily on instruction in English, so for example, talking about Chinese characters in English, talking about Chinese culture in English, translating things to English, and doing lots of explicit instruction in general. There's also a strong focus on the written language over the spoken language. So if you're in that program for, let's say, a year, of course your spoken Chinese and your listening ability will not be that good, and you will struggle with understanding a lesson that is almost entirely in Chinese. Compare that with if you studied with teachers who spoke mostly Chinese from day one, then you would be able to follow this lesson even if you had studied much fewer hours in total. If you are new to learning Chinese and hearing this, you might be a little bit surprised and maybe even outraged. How can it be that a formal institution offers courses that don't actually teach you the language? But I would say that this is actually quite normal. I have studied in many institutions, I've observed others, and I've talked with hundreds of students across the world over the years. And I dare say that this is sadly the rule rather than the exception. Of course, it varies depending on where you are in the world and what the educational system is like, but it's way too common for universities to treat Chinese as an abstract topic that you're studying instead of a language that is used to communicate. So you learn about the language rather than learning the language. This insight is what made me start Hacking Chinese back in 2010, because I realized that my goals and most people's goals are not very well aligned with the curriculum of most courses. So what you need to do is to look at what you want to achieve, then you look at the curriculum and you compare the two and see what you will miss out on, and those things you will need to do on your own. I haven't talked about that in a podcast yet, but if you want to check it out, there is an article called What Your Chinese Course Will Not Teach You, and I will put a link in the description. So to summarize, I would say that most people's Chinese aren't as good as they think it ought to be because they haven't engaged in the right activities for long enough. It's not because they are stupid, they are not talented enough, or Chinese is too difficult or something like that. You just need to make sure that you're doing the right things and that you're doing them enough. And if you do that, you will learn. Of course, as usual, the best way to fix this is to invent a time machine and go back to when you first started learning and just do it right this time. But the next best thing is to start doing it right now and make sure that 5 years from now you don't look back to this period thinking that you should have done something else. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.